Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
A powerful new documentary released in the UK in the past week, Call Me Kuchu, tells the story of the murder of Ugandan gay activist David Kato. And it has once more shone a light on the extent of human rights abuses occurring in certain African countries. But is the outrage that such injustice elicits always helpful? After all, the Western world has been getting hot under the collar about African culture for many centuries. Are we being latter-day missionaries? And does public outrage help or hinder the efforts of the state, NGO and individuals to effect positive social change? Can we get beyond attitudes that perpetuate a sense of African societies as regressive and tragic to encourage a more positive, intelligently informed and productive international human rights discourse and engagement? Please join me in welcoming our panel and our first speaker, Graeme Wood.
In the Central African Republic, I was following in the wake of some of the havoc that was being sown by Joseph Kony. I was able to write a feature piece about this, and surprise, surprise, there's no forgotten war like an African forgotten war. It went nowhere, poof, into nothing. But compare that to what many of you, I'm sure, have heard about, the Kony 2012 documentary that came out this year, which went everywhere. I was living in a small city in North Carolina in USA at the time. And you could see on lampposts pictures of Joseph Kony saying, Joseph Kony 2012. And the connection between the pictures on lampposts and what could actually be done about the remaining depredations of Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army, that connection was difficult to see. On the other hand, it became a subject of great attention and not to say productive attention, but much attention. So to say, first of all, that outrage has a place is something that I can easily agree with from observing that. Similar evolution has happened in the treatment of the issue of the Ugandan anti-homosexuality bill. And that is possible only because of a condign level of outrage over a sort of escalating series of events that were worse, and worse. We're talking about, as of 5 or so years ago, the beginning of tabloid newspapers in Uganda and their forcible outing of many Ugandan gays. In 2009, the introduction of the anti-homosexuality bill by MP David Bahati, which not only criminalized homosexuality to the point of its being a capital offense, but also criminalized the non-reporting of homosexuality. The main mode of interaction with this event, or with these events, was to be outraged, and rather than to be entirely scrupulous with what exactly was happening there. So we saw, for example, a BBC documentary whose title was The World's Worst Place to Be Gay, when, in fact, as most of us know, there are places where to be gay, we do not wait. We have to wait for pending legislation to see capital punishment for gays. So Uganda, it would not be quite as great a title to say the world's 19th worst place to be gay. So the world's worst place to be gay did have to have a question mark at the end. Even among the activists in Uganda, there is what I would say a slight exaggeration, perhaps, certainly a level of outrage. For example, activists who are comparing this law, which, as I need not say, is a ghastly law, to Nuremberg laws, when the likelihood of millions of deaths is extremely low, shall we say, in the near and even medium future in Uganda. So we've got, I hope, to the point where we can transfer out of this mode of outrage and into a mode where there's a more scrupulous accounting of exactly how bad the situation is, exactly how it can be improved, and the way that foreign people and foreign journalists might approach it. One of the activists, Frank Mugisha, was quite clear. He said, we have journalist after journalist coming here and saying that this is a terrible place to be gay. And in many ways, they're right. On the other hand, there is a strong gay community in this place. We have friends, we have places where we meet. If you want to meet gay people in Kampala, it's not difficult to do so. You go to the Rum Bar on Sunday night, and you will find them there. So that, I think, is the stage of the evolution of this that we're sort of in right now, is we're moving beyond what was the kind of outraged foreign spotlight on this. And it's become, in many ways, a domestic and much more difficult struggle that is being protected by the kind of outraged foreign attention that we've had already. The last thing I might say is the role of outrage is in part to draw attention. One of the things that it can't do, and which seemed to be one of the more effective ways to embarrass, really, some of the people who were behind the anti-homosexuality bill and who were the most outrageous, in fact, in its proposal, was to ridicule them. So, for example, there's a pastor, Martin Sempa. The first hits that you will find if you Google him are hits that are of YouTube clips of him being ridiculed. They will take the very best clips from Martin Sempa and set them to music and auto-tune them, and it is line after line of Martin Sempa saying things that are so outrageous that the only reaction is to laugh. That kind of mode of ridicule, which has got to the point, in fact, where Sempa has shown clips of gay pornography in his own congregation, has got even Ugandans who would be very sympathetic to his stance against homosexuality to think, perhaps there's something wrong with this person. That kind of mockery is as strong as anything, I think, in removing these people from public spotlight. I would hope that that would happen more in the future, and that, I think, would be the way forward.
Thanks very much, Graeme.
There's often a big mistake to think that human rights are Western values. In fact, notions of human rights predated the European Enlightenment by at least several hundred years, and in some cases by 2 millennia. You look back to the Cyrus scroll and Darius in Persia, to the great Indian leader Ashoka. You see concepts of human rights hundreds, if not 1,000+ years before they were embraced by Western societies and cultures. And of course, over time, these concepts of human rights have evolved. And it's only recently, within the last 2 or 3 years, that United Nations bodies have explicitly acknowledged that LGBT rights are human rights. And of course, it has since been embraced by other documents. We have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, devised not by the Western colonizers, but by the newly independent nations. And in Articles 2, 3, and 4, it clearly reiterates the principle that every African person, without exception, has a right to equal treatment and non-discrimination. In most cases, the anti-gay laws that exist in African countries were imposed by European colonialism, and particularly by Britain, during the colonial era in the 19th century. They are not authentic national laws that arose from the culture of those societies. They were imposed upon those societies as part of a program of colonization and repression. The sad thing is, of course, that these countries, despite having won their independence, have, in most cases, retained these anti-gay laws. And indeed, the cultural influence of homophobia that went with the colonial administration and the work of Christian missionaries has created such a strong sense of homophobia in these societies, or many of them, that people actually believe it is part of their indigenous African culture. completely ignoring the anthropological evidence that prior to the advent of colonialism, many African societies had people who we would now call homosexual or people in same-sex relationships. And in some of those societies, although perhaps they were not fully accepted, there was a toleration, and even in a few, there were ritualized positions and veneration given to them. That's the truth about homosexuality in Africa. And, you know, it is extraordinary the way in which some of those countries and some of those individuals did eventually speak out against homophobia. And I was involved with Thabo Mbeki in challenging the ANC in the late 1980s over its homophobia and working with L.B. Sachs on the draft ANC constitution to ensure that not only there was an equality and non-discrimination clause in that constitution, but also that it included LGBT human rights. Now, for me, the struggle for LGBT freedom is one of the unfinished aspects of the African liberation struggle. And that change must come, but it's got to come from within. It can't be imposed by the West. We can't wag the finger and make demands. We have to work with, support, and empower the courageous LGBT and human rights defenders in those countries who themselves are making this case from within their own societies, often at incredible personal risk and sacrifice. In my human rights work, I try to work with them. I try to publicize their campaigns. I try to provide resources where it's possible. And I just want to finish by saluting the incredibly brave, heroic LGBT and human rights defenders in countries like Uganda, Nigeria, Malawi, Cameroon, Sierra Leone, the Gambia, Ghana, and elsewhere. The risks they are taking, the courage they are showing, is truly humbling. They are true heroines, true heroes in the struggle for African freedom. Thank you.
I have made a career out of working in international organizations that campaign against injustices. So mobilizing people to be outraged is really, I guess, my business. But I've been very fortunate to work in organizations which Peter has just described, where the whole emphasis is about building authenticity and legitimacy. And that's really hard when you're working in the West and you've got like a constituency of people that you want to mobilize. And how do you talk to people who don't really know about this dark, strange continent that you can go to and for safaris, but on the next day there's a lot of genocide. There are lots of stories about Africa. How do you break through? How do you interest people? So I have some sympathy about how difficult it is and how easy it is to get into the mindset of simplifying things. You know, the Coney 2012 video divided the NGO sector. And then a few days later, some local organizations in Uganda showed the video in a village, and like the kids threw shoes at them. You know, like, oh, that's not us, that's not our country. So it makes you think, who's helping whom? You know, is a campaign might raise awareness, but if it's not legitimate, have you actually changed anything? Have you made the march towards the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? If you feel good about yourself, if you bought a bracelet, if you've clicked and liked something on Facebook, has it made one iota of difference? No. And that's really hard for activists. You know, I'm an activist. I like campaigns. I like to see quick results. But I'm also an African as well. It's also very difficult in this sector. If we're campaigning organizations who are working on this issue, how do we plan? So behind the mechanics of what you see and what you click on Facebook, there's actually quite a machine that goes behind it. We sit together, we sketch out like the key stakeholders, we think of the different ways to persuade the disinterested, and then we push ahead. It's within that process that I think the grassroots should be part of driving. then you know whether you're going to do something that's going to be harmful, that's going to be in solidarity, or if it's just going to mean that you're going to provoke a reaction of some kids throwing some shoes at your video. How distressing it might be to hear. But if you don't give a space for people to talk about where they're coming from, you're not really going to change their mindset. You're just going to keep having shoes thrown at you. And that's difficult, because in campaigning, there seems to be a really interesting story. At least that's what we're doing in the machine room. We have to tell you about the good bad guy, the bad guy, and what you are going to do to solve the problem. But it doesn't work like that in reality to be sustainable. Peter had mentioned the anti-apartheid movement. Like, you see, that was international outrage. We all got together and we stopped that. But what I think that was very different about that movement was you learnt a lot about South African culture. You learnt about the music, you learnt about the struggle, and you knew the names of all the big activists. Where are the names of all the big activists in Africa around some of the issues that we're battling now? You wouldn't know them, you know. They're just not there because they're behind. They're made helpless. They're made the poor survivors, the victims, the case studies, I'm afraid, which we use to raise money from you. But they're not driving the story. And that's very, very dangerous because you do not have a legitimate movement. You've just left a vacuum. You've created an outrage in which we all feel good because we feel we're doing something. But no one is really getting protected, as Peter says, because the movement isn't taking a legitimate form. And that's difficult, and we need to talk about that. So does Africa need our outrage? Yes, it does, because human rights abuses are going on, and they need to be challenged. But it needs our outrage in a more humble way. It needs to accept that Africans can drive change themselves, that they do it on a daily basis, and that if we want to persuade minds, we're going to have to be a little bit more tactical than emotive, and that's difficult in activism, but I hope that will happen. Thank you.
Do we have a responsibility, do we have a right to take an interest in the struggles within Africa for social justice, and what sort of form should that take, that interest? So perhaps I'd be interested to hear from each of you on that question.
Certainly we are being asked to take interest by the activists I spoke to when I was in Uganda last month. They've said, please don't portray us as being merely victims. Don't portray us as not having a strategy other than to throw up our arms and hope to be helped at some point. Instead, portray us as people who are living our lives in some ways very happily, but who have work to do and particular ways that we're going forward. So the activists I spoke to, for example, they had very specific lines of attack that they would continue if, for example, the anti-homosexuality bill were to be passed. And to my knowledge, it's still under consideration to this very day, so it could be passed in the closed-door sessions in which it's being considered any time now. So the type of attention that was being requested was something that was more accurate to the situation.
Peter.
Yes. So a few years ago, some activists in Somaliland and their comrades here who are settled in exile in Britain approached me to try and lobby the British government and the European Union to get recognition, to get aid and trade deals, and to basically publicize to the outside world this incredible African and Muslim success story. You know, Somaliland has gone from civil war and chaos and economic ruination to a functioning multi-party democracy with broad respect for human rights and, you know, a proper system of economic development that is uplifting the people. It's a fantastic, amazing, extraordinary story which we don't hear about. We hear about the war, the human rights abuses, the corruption in Africa. Why don't we hear more about Somaliland? It's an African and Muslim success story. So I've been really proud to work with those people under their guidance to publicize some of the successes that they've achieved.
Thanks. Dorcas.
We never ask the question, how can we help? We just have our outrage. And I think that's what the problem is. It's never about how we can help you. It's more like, this is outrageous and this is what should be done. And I think that culture has to change. But I think it is changing slowly as well, because Africa is becoming more confident in itself. Like, the good news stories are coming out. Activists are feeling more confident. And the economies in Africa are doing much better. And so there's a lot of change that's coming that would change that dynamic. And I think that's great. But it's more about like being humble and asking, how can we help, I think. And I think that's a long way in coming, but I'm hopeful.
Please join me in thanking the panel for a very interesting discussion.